For us. We are really thankful for having you. And I just want to say that my name is Malachi Hernandez. I work with the city of Boston. I'm the mobile enterprise manager, so I oversee all mobile businesses. One of the most common is the food truck program. And I'm really excited. I just want to say that the city of Boston is very just excited and thrilled to be partnering with the Commonwealth Kitchen for this series. And right now, I just want to kick it over to Irene.
Thank you so much, Malachi. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third in our series for the Restaurant Resiliency Initiative out of Commonwealth Kitchen. My name is Irene Lee, and I am the program manager there. I'm also the owner of May Restaurant here in Boston. And tonight, I am so thrilled to introduce my friend Mikey from Ray's High Road Restaurants, who is going to share some of his story as an employer, as a restaurant worker, and share the work that High Road Restaurants is doing to improve working conditions for restaurant workers everywhere and working directly with restaurant owners to do that. So tonight, I think we have a variety of folks in attendance. It looks like a lot of restaurant owners from our own program, as well as some other members of the community. So right before I hand it off to you, Mikey, I'll just add that we are in a webinar format tonight, which means that if you have a question or you would like to participate, you have a couple ways of doing that. You can type something into the chat. You can click the raise hand button, or you can put a question in Q&A, and there will be a few different options for us to allow you to either chime in writing, or if you raise your hand, I think we can allow you to unmute. If you have any technical issues, feel free to reach out to me or Malachi. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Mikey to introduce himself.
Thank you, Irene. It's so good to see you. It's nice to know that all these folks are here on the call. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat too, if you're watching, please feel free to put your name, your restaurant, if you're associated with the restaurant, and what city in the state you're in. As Irene mentioned, my name is Mikey Knab. I use he, him pronouns. I am in occupied Kumeyaay territory, which is commonly referred to as San Diego, California. I run the Mesa Family Restaurant Group. So we have 3 restaurants. There are 2 here in San Diego and 1 in Portland, Oregon. They're all full service, casual Mexican restaurants. I took over operations with my best friends when they inherited the restaurant, the original location from their dad, and then we opened 2 more together. The original location was opened in 1969, so I haven't been there the whole time, but I have been with the company for about 16 years, and now that we have 3 restaurants, it's, my babies. So through that work, I started working with this organization called Ray's High Road Restaurants, which is a national network of a little over 1,000 restaurant owners across the country who have made commitments to what we call high road employment practices. And those take the form of increased wages, improved working conditions, but most importantly to me, and I think more appropriate for this call, is a commitment to race and gender equity in the restaurant industry at large. And we actually think that that last thing that I said is only possible through the other things that I mentioned. I'm going to go backwards in time a little bit to start and tell you a little bit more about myself. I started working in the restaurant industry when I was 15 years old as a dishwasher. And then I worked in pretty much every position in the back of the house until I realized I was not good at any of them. And then they kicked me out and I moved to the front of the house, where I started as a host, and then a busser, then a runner, then a server, then a bar back, then a bartender, then an assistant manager, then a manager, then a general manager. And now I have my own company. So I've done every role there is to have in restaurants. And unfortunately, a lot of what I witnessed when I was 15 that I thought was strange continues to be stranger and more pervasive to this day, which is why in our company and in general now, my main focus is to try and address some of these issues in terms of race and gender inequities from a larger industry-wide standpoint, and even more broadly from a policy standpoint. And I should mention there's a third pillar there, which is like a narrative standpoint. Like, what is the story about restaurant work and restaurant customers, and how do consumers see the true cost in hospitality? So I'm going to unpack some of the issues But then I started noticing other, sorry, my Zoom is telling me that my internet connection is unstable. So if I freeze, someone say so in the chat. I started noticing other disparities in compensation beyond front of the house and back of the house. So there are actually, you can bifurcate the restaurant industry in three ways that I think are quite obvious. One is high-end, more expensive restaurants, white tablecloth places. This represents a very small portion of the restaurant industry, but it's the one that's sort of in public the most because it's on the Food Network and wins Michelin awards and things like that, James Beard Awards. Then there are more casual restaurants with lower price points. This is a much larger part of the restaurant industry. So we're talking about Denny's, Cheesecake Factory, Applebee's. I mean, there's a whole show called Diners, Drive-ins, and Dives, right? So these are where most people who work in the restaurant industry work. So that's the first bifurcation, high-end and casual. Then within each restaurant, there's another split, right? So it's front of the house, that's what we call service, right? And the back of the house, which is the kitchen. Okay, so that's a second split. Now, even within that split, there's another split too, though, which is like the higher tiered earners and the lower tiered earners. So in the front of the house, the higher tiered earners would be like servers, bartenders, service captains, and the second tier of compensation goes to support staff like bussers, runners, and hosts. In the back of the house, you have the same thing. So there's sous chefs, lead line cooks, those are the higher tiered earners. And then on the lower tier of earning, you have dishwashers, porters, prep cooks. Now, every time I split the restaurant industry in my head that way, I noticed something in terms of racial impacts. So in higher end restaurants, more expensive restaurants, people are more likely to be white that work there. In the more casual restaurants, people more likely to be people of color. Then in the front of the house, back of the house split, folks who work in the front of the house, more likely to be white, people who work in the back of the house, more likely to be people of color. And then once we get to that final split, the folks in the top tier of earners, either in front of the house or back of the house, the folks who are servers and bartenders and things tend to be white folks more often than not. And the folks who are in the support positions more likely to be people of color. Same thing again in the back of the house, the sous chefs, chefs, lead line, more likely to be white. Folks in the more support positions like prep cook, dishwasher, porter, more likely to be people of color. And every time I split that, the folks who make more money are the white folks, and the folks who make less money are the people of color more likely. So this is the problem with that, is that folks who are in the industry looking to get to a top tier compensation type of position in a high-end restaurant have systemic barriers to getting there. And this is not the fault of any one restaurant owner. It's not the fault of any one company. It's the fault of the system of the industry that we've all grown to love and participate in, being built around policies and norms and a narrative, sort of what I said before, policy shift, industry shift, narrative shift, that's been in place for over 100 years. The restaurant industry prior to COVID was the second largest private sector employer in our country. So that's math.
Hey, Mikey, I think we lost you.
Tell me when I'm melted.
There you are.
Okay, what was the last thing I said before I froze?
You were just starting to talk about how the restaurant industry was the second largest, I think, private employer force. Okay.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. So prior to COVID, the restaurant industry was the second largest private sector employer in the country with close to 14 million workers, but also boasted 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs in the country. Also the highest reliance on public assistance of any sector and the highest rates of sexual harassment. So I outlined why this is a racial issue. Now I'm outlining why it's a gender issue. 70% of tipped workers in our country are women. Many of those folks are moms. So if you think about that, the second largest and fastest growing, meaning more and more of these jobs are going to more and more of a percentage of our workforce that is disproportionately women and people of color. And it's 7 of the 10 lowest paying positions and the highest rates of sexual harassment. This is not the magic of hospitality that I fell in love with, right? From the time I was 15 on through now. The good news is there is a path forward to address these issues. I want to go back a little further. I did mention 100 years ago was kind of the start to the systems of how this industry works. There is a sub minimum wage for tipped employees in our country. I think most of you know that. In 43 states plus DC, which should also be a state, you can pay lower than a minimum wage to tipped workers, as long as it's implicit that the tips will make up the difference between that sub minimum wage and the full minimum wage. So there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, its origins are in slavery. After the abolishment of slavery, formerly enslaved people went to look for jobs, and many companies wanted to offer jobs to these folks without paying a wage and letting them work completely for tips as the entirety of their compensation. And this was allowed at the time. So these companies were mainly hotels, railroad companies, and restaurants. So for about 40 years, that was the case. People could work for zero and have a tip be a wage replacement. Although this is a perversion of the original version of the tip, which came from Europe, from nobles and essentially rich merchants in Europe who would practice this, what's called noblesse oblige, which is like rich folks doing nice things for poor people to show off how rich they are. It was always on top of a wage. It was always additional, sort of an extra bonus in Europe. But then when it came to the United States after the abolition of slavery, these companies tried to change it so that they would not have to pay formerly enslaved people to do work in these industries and just let the customers pay them directly through tips. So that's how we started with tips, being a wage replacement. And then for about 40 years after that, this was allowed until 1938, when the Fair Labor Standards Act passed, which is the original minimum wage law in our country as part of the New Deal. And in that negotiation to get the minimum wage enacted, the Delano Roosevelt administration made a deal with a new association, a new trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association, that at the time said, we're fine with there being a minimum wage as long as we don't have to pay it to tipped workers. So then in 1938, it became codified that tipped workers would not make a full minimum wage. And that went from zero in 1938 all the way to $2.13 an hour in the early 90s, which is where it sits now federally. Now, I know that in different states it's higher. I think in Massachusetts it's 5 something, and the full minimum wage is getting close to 15 now. So I said, you know, as a lot of folks will say, but tips make up the difference, right? The problem is that's not exactly what happens in practice. The EEOC in 2014 did a study of over 3,000 restaurants across the country and found that in this system where you're supposed to make up the delta between the sub-minimum and the full minimum wage with tips, 84% of restaurants did not properly make sure that that was happening and were in violation of the law. And therefore we're committing wage theft, though most of them not on purpose. The problem is that the system is very obtuse and really, really difficult to track and very, very hard to maintain. I'm not certain that everyone realizes this, but that accounting of the difference between sub-minimum and full minimum is meant to be done on a per shift basis, not a per pay period basis. So you can't make up for Tuesday's slow lunch shift with Friday night's dinner service. I know I'm going into the weeds a little bit here, but the reason is that since 70% of tipped workers are women, and there is so much violation of this law, whether it's on purpose or not, that means that this workforce that's almost 14 million strong and disproportionately women and people of color is almost exclusively dependent on customer whims and tips for their income, which leads to the highest rates of sexual harassment in any industry. I had a conversation with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a few months ago, and she mentioned, because she used to be a bartender, that on the second of the month, she was way less likely to put up with inappropriate advances from customers because she had just paid rent and she was good financially. But if it were the 29th or 30th of the month and she still needed to make a little extra in order to cover rent, she was more likely to put up with that. And as the conversation carried on, we talked about how restaurants are actually the first job for a lot of people in America, meaning that sort of sets the standard for what they think is acceptable for working conditions for the rest of their career. And if you're setting the standard for what's acceptable in terms of harassment, abuse, inappropriate behavior based on an industry with the highest rates of sexual harassment, that's a bleak outlook for the rest of your career. Okay, I promise I'm getting done with the dark stuff, because I want to get hopeful now. So the incredible part is that we've now had over 30 years of data to prove that there's a better way. There are 7 states in our country that have eliminated the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, and those states are Nevada, Montana, Minnesota, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and California. So those states have a full minimum wage for everybody with tips on top. And if you remember in my introduction, my restaurants are in those states, California and Oregon. And I can tell you from experience, both as a worker in restaurants, but also with my own company, that it works. Not only does it work, it's better than the other option. And the reason it works is because everybody has to do it. It's one thing if you're a restaurant owner to try and do this on your own, what I would say is like on an island, and try to raise wages and improve working conditions. And that's amazing and it's laudable. And I know some restaurant owners across the country who are able to make it work, but they're at a competitive disadvantage to their neighboring businesses because their costs are just higher. So the prices on their menu are going to look a little bit off compared to their neighbors. Whereas for me, I'm lucky because I can pay those wages and improve working conditions and compete with everybody on my block or in my city just based on the quality of my food and service, which I'm always happy to do, especially because my staff is very happy. So the restaurant industries in these states have been more successful on average than in the states that don't have a full minimum wage, in terms of new restaurants opening, in terms of full-time positions being offered, in terms of course, wages, and also strangely, or maybe not strangely, but to some surprising, tips. Tips are actually higher in the states with the full minimum wage with tips on top. Another cool thing that happened from a policy perspective was that in 2018, so 3 years ago, the Fair Labor Standards Act, that 1938 minimum wage law, it was updated, and they added a budget rider to it federally, which said that tips are the property of workers, meaning owners can't take part in any sort of tip pooling scenario. But they also said that in any restaurant across the country, if you pay a full minimum wage to tipped workers, meaning you don't take advantage of the sub-minimum wage or what some call the tip credit, you are allowed to require a tip distribution system that includes the back of the house. This is a game changer. This is the thing that I noticed when I was a dishwasher, when I was trying to pretend like I knew how to saute. I don't know if any of you remember if you've ever been servers, but when you have a crazy busy Friday night and you're counting your cash at the end of the night and you made $400, $500 in tips, you definitely don't want to do that in front of the kitchen, because those folks just work just as hard or harder than you for more hours, and they're making the same wage that they always make because they're not in the tip pool. In 2018, the federal government said, no more of that. You are allowed to share tips with anyone on staff that's not ownership or management that has control over hiring, firing, or scheduling, final say in scheduling, as long as you pay the full minimum wage. Now, unfortunately, for those of you on this call, there are 2 states where this is not true, and that is New York and Massachusetts. And that is because those 2 states have state level legislation that supersedes this budget rider on the Fair Labor Standards Act, meaning even if you do choose to pay the full minimum wage and put yourself at that competitive disadvantage because it's not the law in your state, you still can't share tips with the back of the house. That's the part that's really frustrating, I think, for me when I talk to folks from your state, because it's the best, easiest, most incredible way to address the wage inequity is to say, we're going to have the front of the house take 20% of the tips they take in and put them into a back of the house tip pool, and that's going to bring our back of the house compensation levels up way higher than we were able to before, when they were only being compensated through straight wages from the employer. It also helps with the sexual harassment part of the front of the house, because folks who are making a full minimum wage, let's say it's $15 an hour, like it's about to be in Massachusetts, know that they at least are making $15 an hour, regardless of what customers decide on a whim about their appearance or performance. And once again, in terms of tipping, there have been many, many studies that show that there's gross implicit bias in the way that tips are given out. Last year, a study was done of tipped workers that found Black female tipped workers made on average $5 an hour less than their white male counterparts nationally. That's nationally. In the state of Massachusetts, it's actually $8 an hour. So $8 an hour amortized over a 20-year career, if you only work 30 hours a week, is over $300,000. So that's literally the cost of a home, a modest home, that's being robbed from some folks just because of implicit bias. It has nothing to do with whether they're a good server or bartender. It has everything to do with subconscious decision making on the part of the tipping public. So making a full minimum wage alleviates some of that. Did I freeze again, Irene?
No, I just wanted to add that we, at Maymay, we have an amazing community of guests, and we still found that there were pretty significant racial and gender disparities in tipping. And so to me, that is just a great demonstration of the fact that it is implicit bias for the most part. And also we had a question about why Massachusetts and New York are not, or why we have our own laws about what happens to those tips. And you mentioned it briefly, but if you could maybe talk just a little bit more about that, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, so my answer to your question is I wish I knew exactly the answer. First of all, I'm not used to seeing state laws that supersede federal laws. There is we are in a federalist system, so there are certain things that are left up to states, but setting the floor on labor protections is not typically done this way. So when I first learned about this, I was honestly a bit surprised and confused. Even more confusing to me, though, is what is the reason for it? Whether it's like normal kind of operation for government, that's one way to be confused. But I really can't understand why anyone would not want to allow for tip sharing with the back of the house were the full minimum wage to be paid. The only folks I can think of who would be against it would be, I mean, I'll just be transparent, would be the folks who make the most money in the current system. So really high-end servers and bartenders. A lot of times they will feel like they're at risk of losing some of their the ceiling on compensation for folks like that is really high in the restaurant industry. We don't want to change that. That's how I paid for college, right? I waited tables the whole time. And we're not trying to change that. The servers in those 7 states that I mentioned that have what we call one fair wage, a full minimum wage for tipped workers with tips on top, servers at my restaurants, they make $45 an hour. It's not suddenly that tips go away or the kitchen takes all the tips and now everybody's making less. That's just not the case. So I wish I had a better answer for you, Cheryl, but I don't know why, but I do know that we have state level legislation moving in Massachusetts in the Assembly and the Senate, that would address this, that would allow for tip sharing with the back of the house and would require one fair wage, which would make Massachusetts like those other 7 states and come into the more equitable future, which I think is going to be more resilient for our industry as a whole. I hope that got somewhere near answering your question. I think that's the best I can do. So now I'm going to move into how do we make it happen? So one is support the legislation. That is the quickest and best way to get Massachusetts to a place where you're on a level playing field with all your competitors, and also you get to pay what's closer to a living wage, while ensuring that everyone in the restaurant benefits from our success, not just the front of the house, who enjoy all of the tips. The second, so that's policy. The other one is industry. So this is how do we operate our own businesses? I'm happy to share some of my strategies in my restaurants that have made us more profitable while also investing more in our workforce. And I would say that I don't suggest anybody take on all of these things at once. I really like the idea of an iterative process where we bring our workforce into the decision-making process. So this can start with recruitment, interviewing, hiring, training, promotional practices, cross-training, developing a professional pathway from I've never worked in a restaurant and I'm interested, to director of operations, to head chef, to owner. Because dignifying the work and professionalizing the industry is really what's going to save us, and it's really what's going to encourage workers in general in the country to consider restaurant jobs attractive. I see you came off.
Hi, yeah, I
There you
just wanted to mention that I think a number of our attendees tonight are counter service or like quick service operators. And so if they might be wondering, how is this related to me? I know that you have some talking points around that. And obviously I think everyone here is interested in the gender and racial equity piece of this, but I think for quick service operators, there are some particularly salient points. So if I could ask you to just spend a minute on that, I'm sure it was later in your talking points, but.
Yeah, certainly. No, thanks for, and please interrupt more because I don't, I know no one wants to hear the same person talk for the whole time. So for counter service, it's incredibly important because one, this is a quick growing part of our industry, right? Like this is going to be probably half of the industry sometime soon. It's unfair that full service restaurants get to pay a sub minimum wage and you don't. Like you're at a competitive disadvantage at that point. B, the cross training part where we're trying to convince people to learn how to run food and then learn how to be a host and then learn how to serve and also if you start in the kitchen and you can then learn to run food and come to the front of the house, or if you start as a food runner and you want to learn how to work the line, that makes running a restaurant a heck of a lot easier. And in counter service, I think it's been my experience that it's a little easier to culturally achieve that, to convince your staff that it's worth learning both sides of the business or two of the many sides of the business. In terms of race and gender as it relates to counter service, I don't have studies to support this claim, but anecdotally, I find that total compensation from counter service restaurants is frequently less because of the absence of tips or because of the absence of the same kind of agreed upon percentage in tipping culture. Like at full service restaurants, it's at least 15% or 20%, depending on what part of the country you're in, I suppose. At counter service restaurants and coffee shops and things like that, it feels a little looser to me. And I'd be happy to hear if I'm wrong about that from those of you who work directly in that side of the industry. I notice folks at coffee shops and counter service restaurants sort of just rounding up to the nearest dollar, leaving a few dollars. I do think that these like iPads that suggest percentages for tips are going to help a lot with that. But in the end, the main point for me for the counter service thing is it's wildly unfair that your staff, you're required to pay your staff so much more than people who are tipped directly because it's full service. The only difference is that they're walking to a table rather than taking an order at the counter. I'm simplifying, obviously. I think all these jobs are incredibly hard and very important, but that includes counter service jobs. So I hope that got to your question, Irene. So the last one is narrative shift, and Irene's been incredible at this. I think before we became friends, I was already a fan of Irene's because she did this article with Eater talking about open book accounting and trying to really get our consumer base to understand what does it actually cost to give you this experience, to have you be able to come here, sit in a beautifully designed space, enjoy great welcoming service and delicious food, and not have to do dishes. What does that take? What does it cost? And they went through like line by line the profit and loss sheet. And at the end, it was like, I can't remember. I mean, I think it was less than 2% profit. So that is not sustainable. It's not that if you were speaking to a bunch of MBA students and you gave them a bunch of filled out business plans, but you blanked out the name or type of business, no one would choose restaurants because the profit margins are so slim and the consistency of sales are volatile. They're seasonal in a lot of occasions. But we stay on it because the volume can sometimes make up for it. But really, I think, and I hope that some of you all feel this way too, it's that we have passion for this. Like, I love the fact that every other restaurant owner I know, even every bartender, server, lots of line cooks I know, they know everyone in the community. If you say, hey, I need a recommendation for a mechanic or a dentist or a CPA, they've got a guy, or they know someone. And that's because restaurants are community hubs. They are where we come to celebrate our victories and our wins, and where we go to commiserate when we experience loss. And it's the comfort zone. And that's not just for consumers, that's also for those of us who chose this as a profession. And that's my main goal, is to get our profession to feel that way for as many people as possible, because for so many people right now, it doesn't. As I mentioned earlier, we have the highest reliance on public assistance of any industry, which means that taxpayers are subsidizing free breadsticks. So the consumer thinks breadsticks aren't worth anything because Olive Garden gives them away for free. So that means that I don't get to charge for chips and salsa in Mexican restaurants. But the truth is, none of that stuff is free. And so in that context, taxpayers are literally subsidizing that, which is a race to the bottom for us. None of us are able to charge the true cost of food and hospitality. And just like the Biden administration is now saying human investment is infrastructure, I think making sure that our staff are able to afford to live near the restaurants where they work is part of the true cost of food and hospitality. And I think the narrative shift part for me is like getting everybody to know that, getting everybody to be conscious consumers. I guess conscientious consumer is a better way. I think everybody that comes to my restaurants are conscious all the time, but that's the narrative shift. So I'm going to go back to industry shift, operational shift, and give you a couple of strategies that I think are helpful. And the main goal here is to empower our workforce and give them an opportunity to have agency over their own working life and their professional career, so that they can see these jobs as attractive, and we can retain people, because turnover is a cost that I think people highly undervalue. I've calculated that every time someone leaves one of my restaurants, it costs me at least $2,000. That would be like if I hired a dishwasher, trained them to work, they stayed for a month and then they left. It would cost me $2,000 to replace that person. If I have to replace someone that's been with me for 3, 4, 5 years, that's been trained in 5, 6 positions, it's going to cost me more like $3,500 or $4,000. That's a lot of money. You could give everybody on staff an extra $1 an hour if you just made sure you didn't lose 4 people this year, something like that. So for me, these strategies are helpful in terms of that cost. And when you reduce turnover, you also increase efficiency. So people that stay longer are better at their job, they're trained in more positions, scheduling becomes easier, they're better at upselling and maximizing your profit margin, keeping maybe the wages per hour might be higher, but your overall labor costs will be lower because you're getting more out of the amount of experience and talent you have on your team. So that's my main goal here. And the way I like to think of things is like, we run this restaurant together. Danny Meyer calls it your internal customer, right? So, you have external customers that buy food from you. Those are the folks that walk in the door and want a sandwich. But the folks that I'm serving are really the people that have agreed to trade labor for money. So I want to make sure that the amount of money I'm giving them is a good deal for them and a good deal for me, and that the working conditions under which they're coming and spending their time feel good for them, so that they'll want to stay, and our industry will continue to be magic. One thing I did recently is I democratized tips. And once again, this is not legal in Massachusetts right now, but it can be with service charges, and I'll talk about that in a second. I set up a tip distribution system in my restaurant where I said servers give X amount to the kitchen tip pool at the end of each shift. And takeout tips are distributed this way. And at the end of a shift, servers tip the support staff, like bussers and runners, X amount. But during COVID, that all changed because we closed completely, and then we were only doing takeout and delivery. And when we were only doing takeout and delivery, I didn't have servers. I didn't have bartenders. I had, my porter was literally batching margaritas in mason jars because we were suddenly allowed to sell them to go. But it was pretty much all back of the house employees working for about 2 months. And I thought, well, this tip distribution system doesn't it's not even accordant with what we're doing. So we just went to a straight tip pool. All the tips that came in, we distributed them based on hours worked equally among everybody who wasn't a manager. And that was incredible. It was like, I watched these kitchen workers who before COVID were making, taking home something like $19 an hour after their portion of the tips on the previous distribution model. And now they were all making like 28, 32. And it was the amount of stress that I just saw wash away from them was amazing to see. And as we slowly opened up for outdoor dining and then limited capacity indoor dining, I wasn't willing to go back to this thing where, even though in my restaurants I've always had a tip distribution with the back, it was still kind of far apart. And I told the front of the house as they came back, things are going to change. So I set up a new system that was much more generous for back of the house pooling. But then we got busier in-house and everything. And so the service staff started to see that stress that I saw wash away from the back of the house.
Oh, we lost you, Mikey. Okay, as Mikey defrosts from his frozen state. There he is.
Okay, where did I leave off, Irene?
As people started to get busier, as you started to get busier for indoor dining or for on-site dining.
Yeah, thanks. So all that stress I saw wash away from the back of the house, folks, started to bubble up for the front of the house, folks, because they were like, look, it's harder. We're walking twice as far because now all of a sudden our restaurant's in the parking lot and it's really hot outside in August in San Diego and we were wearing masks and some people were being really cool about the mask stuff and every once in a while people were not that cool. So they said, we set up our lives and our cost of living based on what we used to make, and now we're not making quite as much, even though it feels like the work is harder. But we understand where you're coming from, that like the kitchen should make more than they used to. I just said to my goal that I set out at the beginning of what I was saying in this portion of the conversation, I want to empower you. Like, this is your money. The tips, I'm not working for tips. I haven't worked a floor shift in many years. So if you all want to tell me what's best, I will listen to you. So I said, if you democratically elect 2 representatives from the front of the house and 2 representatives from the back of the house, so majority of front of the house would have to say, we want to have these 2 people represent us, majority of back of the house do the same. And then those 4 people form a council. They negotiate a tip distribution system among them. They don't need me to be involved. If they can ask me for guidance if they'd like. And then if they come to a unanimous decision, I will enact it, as long as A, it's legal, and B, it doesn't take me 8 hours to do payroll. I said it couldn't be one thing on Tuesday from noon to 4 and then a different thing on Friday night. It just has to be one system. So they did it. It took them a month. They negotiated. They changed 2 things from mine, but they were minor, but they were blind spots that I had. And I'm very thankful that they changed them, because now the kitchen's making way more than they were before COVID. The front of the house is getting very close to what they had pre-COVID and sometimes more, and everybody's happy. And we don't have that issue with front of the house making a ton of money and not being able to talk about it after their Friday night shift. Interestingly, at the other location, we did the same thing, and they all chose to stay with an equal tip pool. They said, we love how this makes us feel. And all the folks at that restaurant, well, not all, almost all, are asking to learn how to work in different positions. So I have way more people now that work both front and back of the house. And in terms of retention, that has been the best tool ever. Someone says, oh, I got a flat tire, I can't come in for my line cook shift. And one of the people that works as a food runner says, oh, I can work the line. That is a game changer for me. I mean, the level of stress that's left in my past has been incredible in terms of that experience. I would also say there are so many other options. I just wanted to give you that one example of a way that we empowered the staff, but there's a lot of ways to save money in operations that I would typically just use as when people hire me as a consultant, like check your linen contract, make sure there's no auto renew in there and no automatic increase. I'll help you negotiate your lease, all these kinds of things. And the reason I'm mentioning these ones is because what I'm going to pitch you on now is to join my organization, Raise High Road Restaurants. It's free. So it costs you nothing. It doesn't even cost you time beyond like the 5 minutes it takes to fill in the survey for onboarding. But what you get from it is access to these 1,000+ restaurant owners across the country who have all employed different strategies to make sure that they are not only able to invest in equity in terms of their teams and their communities, but also that they're financially prosperous. Because in the end of the day, if we're all making 2% profit, we're not going to be around that much longer, and it won't matter if we're trying to professionalize the industry. So you have access to this network where everyone shares challenges and best practices, and oh my gosh, I did this promotion and it worked great. Or, oh, you know, we found a way to get direct access healthcare to a doctor rather than through a broker. That was our last call. We have a monthly call with all of our members, and last Monday was our May call, and we had a doctor from Austin, Texas, who said, I do direct care for restaurant workers. And it was like, whoa, what a light bulb for some of the folks on the call. If you can find a physician in your area that's willing to do this, the cost savings is massive. So I think those are a couple of the things that I would say are good ways to start. So help get this policy passed in Massachusetts. There's also a federal bill, the Raise the Wage Act, that would make it happen for the whole country. And then perhaps join Raise. The last piece of resources I should share about Raise is that we do have a race and gender equity training program for restaurant owners and operators. It's 3 modules. They're all digital. Of course, now everything's digital, but mainly that's because when you get on these trainings, you go to module 1, which is 2 hours long. They're run by my colleague Jeannie Chun and our other colleague Teresa Contreras. So they happen in English and Spanish, and we're working on adding languages to that as more demand increases. But you get on there and you're on a call with people from all over the country. So you're in Massachusetts, you may be on a call with folks from North Carolina, from San Francisco, from Montana, from Texas. And it's really cool to hear what these folks have done to address the inequities in terms of race and gender in our industry in their own, from their own frame of reference in their own community. And that training is also free, and each module is 2 hours. So free to members. I'm gonna stop pontificating. I think we have maybe 10, 15 minutes left. Does anyone have questions? I hope that I've kind of painted a somewhat complete picture here, but I'm happy to hear from others.
We'll give people a moment to warm up their typing fingers. I was wondering, Mikey, if you could speak a little bit to the role of the Massachusetts Restaurant Association in these conversations. During this time of COVID, I feel like MRA has really tried to be a hero for restaurants like the ones on this call, and would love to hear a little bit more about some of the work that they're doing that maybe I'm not a huge fan of, and how we can kind of be addressing that as an industry, even though we need lots of help from different organizations that are ready to advocate for us.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Irene. So I'm going to talk about the National Restaurant Association first. The National Restaurant Association has state level affiliates in every single state. So MRA is the National Restaurant Association affiliate in Massachusetts. I mentioned before, they've been around for over 100 years, and their number one by far priority always has been suppressing wages and subjugating our workforce. That is why there is a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. It's also why it's still $2.13 an hour federally. In 1992, when the Clinton administration was trying to enact a minimum wage increase, the National Restaurant Association, by the way, they have more money, power, and influence by far than the other NRA. We hear about like trade lobbies and how powerful they are. The Restaurant Association is one of the top 5 most powerful lobbies in DC. And in each state, that's also true. So in Massachusetts, that's very true. In 1992, Herman Cain, who was the head of the National Restaurant Association at the time, made a bargain with the Clinton administration and said, we won't fight this minimum wage increase as long as you freeze the sub-minimum wage at $2.13 per hour. So it's not indexed to any increase. It doesn't rise with the minimum wage. And that's why it's still that way almost 30 years later. Now, the reason I mention this is because because they're so powerful, if they decided to stop working on that, if someone in leadership there said, you know what, these folks are right, Irina's right, we cannot have a resilient restaurant industry without investing in our workforce. We can't continue to have 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs. That is actually worse for restaurants. So what we're going to do is stop fighting this. We're going to say, let's go ahead and find a smart way to get that up to a full wage, like let's scale it up over 5 years, 6 years, 7. To be honest with you all on this call, if it took 10 years, I would still consider it a huge win, because it would finally be codified. There is an end to this sub minimum wage. If they did that, they could work on things that would actually help the restaurant industry much, much more, like healthcare reform, immigration reform. Over 10% of our workforce is undocumented. Insurance regulation reform. I don't know how many of you who own restaurants got any business interruption insurance payments, but I didn't. I don't know anybody that did. But my businesses were all interrupted last year, and I've been paying into that policy for over a decade. So these are the kinds of things they could accomplish, but they don't work on that. They work in states like Massachusetts, and also, by the way, in California, where we have one fair wage, they still work gets brought up every legislative session to get rid of it. But we'll never go back here because we've seen how successful it is. In fact, on a shareholders call a couple of weeks ago, the CFO of Denny's said that the company in California, where there's one fair wage with tips on top, outperformed the system, meaning that restaurants in that state where it's supposedly so expensive, restaurants will go out of business if you raise the minimum wage, or they won't hire as many workers. The Denny's there were doing better than everywhere else. So all these shareholders on the call said, wait a second, how can that be? And yet you fund the NRA and each state level version of it to constantly fight against that. That seems like you're violating your fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders, which is true. That's why now there's a lawsuit against them. So in that sense, my hope is that the restaurant associations, because they are made up of restaurant owners. I mean, my belief is not that people at the restaurant association are evil villains twisting their mustache at home all day. What I think they are is folks who think they're doing the right thing for the industry and are just ill-informed or misguided. So my hope is that we can just convince them to stop fighting it. And the last thing I'll say about them, though, is that most of their funding for lobbying does not come from their members. Most of their funding for lobbying comes from ServSafe, which most people don't realize is owned by the National Restaurant Association. Most workers pay for their own food safety training. And most workers I know that pay for ServSafe think it's a governmental organization, but it's not. It's a private for-profit company that charges workers to be trained in food safety and then takes that money and spends it on lobbying to subjugate that workforce. That those very people are funding their own, I guess I'd say diminishment of working conditions. Let's see. So no questions yet in the chat? No.
I think, Mikey, something else that you shared with me on another call that I thought was really interesting is that the NRA and some of their affiliates also try to keep how all of this works as secret as possible, including from people who own restaurants. And so I think, pretty much everyone on this call, as far as I can tell, has been in the position of saying, like, I don't understand what the rules are. Whether it's tips, whether it's other aspects of employment. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit too.
Yeah, my position is that it's purposefully obtuse. It's obfuscated because they don't want it to change. I mean, if let me think of it. I'll give you an example. So Tom Colicchio has a bunch of restaurants, right? And he's famous. So everybody knows that he's rich. He's on TV all the time. Meaning everybody that works for him at his restaurants, if they have a beef, that's not supposed to be a pun because Kraft is a steakhouse, but if they have a beef with their employer, they're going to go, you know what? I can litigate against this guy. He's on Top Chef, right? He's wealthy guy. So Tom told me, he's like, I pay one fair wage because it's just safer for me. He's like, I don't want to open myself up to what's called the 80-20 provision, which is one of those things that obfuscates stuff. 80-20 says that if you're paying someone a sub-minimum wage as a tipped worker, they have to do 80% of their work direct customer facing. So like side work, like cleaning bathrooms or stocking things, that can only take up 20% or less of their time. If it takes up more than that, they have a wage theft claim against you. And Tom says, I don't want to have to worry about that. That's impossible to track, right? To track every single one of your workers and see whether they're at the table side 80% of the time or making roll-ups, it's impossible to track. It's also, as I mentioned earlier, tracking that, making up the delta between subminimum and full with tips per shift. I mean, you'd have to have a full-time person that just does that. So it's purposefully obtuse so that lawmakers can't understand it. It's not really meant to be something that's confusing for owners. It's meant to be confusing for workers and lawmakers. The unfortunate part is that owners and operators are the ones that are supposed to actually make it work. And it's not any easier for us to understand or track. This is why it's so much easier in Oregon and California where I am. It's just, this is the wage. I don't have to track anything to do with making up the difference. And there is no such thing as 80-20 when you pay a full minimum wage, because that's how all jobs are. Like if you work at a retail store, they don't say 80% of your time has to be on the sales floor. They just say, here's your job, this is your list of responsibilities, and this is how much we're paying you. And if you agree to those terms, then that's how the job works. I mean, obviously you can't violate other labor protections, but our industry has more weird, difficult, challenging to understand things governing the way we interact with our workforce than any other industry I know of. And I'm pro labor protection person, like I want labor protections, but I want them to be smart and I want them to benefit everybody involved.
Yeah. My colleague Dylan just wanted to make sure everybody heard that 80-20 is actually also a beef pun. So now you have a couple lined up for that, Mikey.
Oh yeah, Dylan, good one. Thank you.
Dylan's turning pink right now as we speak. So I think the last thing I wanted to mention was that the churn here is that we would love for everyone here to join RAISE. And I think it's really important to note that joining RAISE does not require you to make any changes to how you compensate your team. RAISE is really asking restaurant owners to say, I think race and gender equity would be great. And I am open to talking about policy that can address that. With RAISE, May and a number of other restaurants have had opportunities to speak to the press, to work with our representatives at the city and state level. So there's a lot of cool stuff that RAISE does. And there are so many different professional organizations that you can join when you are a restaurant owner. And I will just say from a personal experience, RAISE is the one where I feel like they're my people and they want the same things that I want for this industry. And Mikey, we do have a question from Marisol about how you approach wage and harassment conversations with your employees. I think communicating these issues is something that can be a big challenge, right?
Yeah, certainly. And thank you for saying such nice things about RAISE, Irene. I put our website in the chat. If you scroll down towards the bottom of the page, you'll see one of my dear friends there next to the Stay Connected button. And I'm just putting Irene on blast here. But to your question, Marisol, it's different. Every conversation is nuanced and dynamic. Every restaurant is different. The way your service model is set up and the way your management structure is set up is going to be different from your neighbor or from mine. What I will say in general is I think the best way to approach these conversations is proactively. Don't wait until something happens and then react to it, because it's much, much harder to ensure that you're following best practices and making space for everybody involved to feel safe and heard. If you're reacting to things, if it's in the immediate. So proactively, some things I suggest are: one, go through the race and gender equity training program. It has a lot to do with wages. It has a lot to do with the way you hire, train, recruit, and promote people. Sexual harassment, I highly suggest that you have at least all your managers go through sexual harassment training. I also highly suggest de-escalation training, especially after COVID with like all the mask stuff, and maybe just in our polemic society in general right now. I've found that my staff has gone through a little more stressful interactions with guests, but also among each other over the last year and a half. We're just all sort of like mentally in a weird space, and having the tools that you can gain through those kinds of training, I think, are really helpful. The other thing I would mention is that RAISE is not the only organization that would offer this, but many organizations, including us, would happily act as a mediator between you and your staff to give you an opportunity to cure a problem before it gets litigious. If we find, I'll be honest with you, if we find that someone has grossly and neglectfully and deliberately violated labor laws, we may say, well, we can't be an arbitrator here. It seems that the truth is that you actually did steal their money or sexually harass them or whatever. And we will tell you that, but we won't then sue you ourselves. What we'll do is say, we can't arbitrate for you. But in 95+% of the cases that we've had these kinds of conversations, we do find an amicable solution that has nothing to do with litigation or compensation. It's a lot more to do with like, let's commit to a systemic change and let's empower the employees to have a seat at the table and making the kinds of decisions that affect what's really more to do with their lives than ours. You know, they're the folks who are there every day working these shifts, direct customer facing. And I know some of us do that too. I know that there are a lot of people, especially in like new restaurants and definitely in some of the counter service situations that I know, where it's like, hey, don't act like I'm not here at 6 in the morning until like 2 in the morning, you know? And I feel you. I did that for quite a long time. So man, I hope that answers your question, Marisol.
Awesome. So I think we are going to close it out. We're coming up on the hour. I did just drop the Google form to join Raise and become a High Road restaurant in the chat. The form takes about 5 minutes, and if you need my help with it, I would be delighted to go through it with you in our next one-on-one meeting if we have one. Mikey, I want to thank you so much again for coming and chatting with this group. The work that you and Raise do is one of the things that makes me feel like this industry is worth continuing to work on. So thank you so much for that. And Mikey, if people want to get in touch with you, do you want to drop a couple things in the chat?
Yep. So one thing, I'll put my email here and I'll put my cell phone number. And I will also say, I forgot to say one other cool thing you get if you sign up as a member of Raise, which you don't have yet, Irene, because I just got them. But these are like little window clings, and you get to put it in your window and show people that you've made these commitments to race and gender equity and a more resilient industry. And the reason I'm showing you essentially what's a sticker is that I want that to really mean something, not just to each other, but to consumers in terms of the narrative shift, and also to workers. Like, what restaurant do you want to work in your city? If it's got this sticker on the door, hopefully that'll tell you something about where you're applying. And of course, you'll get a digital version for your website and stuff too.
Awesome. Mikey, thank you so much again. We look forward to keeping you in touch and connecting you with all the folks who are able to join us today. Once again, this has been a production of Commonwealth Kitchen's Restaurant Resiliency Initiative. Malachi and everyone else at the City of Boston who helped us put this on, thank you so much for hosting us. We are going to have a recording of this session available to distribute. So if you know someone who you think might be interested in Raise and would like to watch this, please let me know and I can get it out to you. And with that, I'll say thank you, everyone. Oh, Cecilia, do you have a question? Are we going to sneak you in? I unmuted Cecilia.
It looks like she's still muted. Oh, there we go.
Hi, Cecilia.
No, it's not a hi. It's not a question, but I've been following and I actually thought that I've already filled out that form yet, but then I went onto the website and I did not see my name. So I will fill out the form again to move forward.
If you've already filled it out, you're probably just in between having filled it out and us updating the website.
Okay.
I don't know how to use WordPress, so I have to like actually have someone on the team do it every month. So if you feel like filling it out again, that's great. But if you've already done it, your restaurant will make its way onto the site shortly.
All right, good to know. Thank you.
Yay, thank you, Cecilia.
I love it. Also, please feel free to email me if you have any questions about anything. Like if you want me to look at your linen contracts, I'm happy to do it. Like anything like that.
I email Mikey for random stuff all the time. Super useful. Amazing. Hi, Malachi. Thank you so much again for hosting us.
Yeah, of course. Again, I just want to say thank you to all of the attendees. We appreciate it. The City of Boston was again truly honored to partner with the Commonwealth Kitchen on this project. And we hope that you all found it valuable just as much as we have on the panelist side. So thank you so much again.
Amazing. All right. Have a great rest of your night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.